Hello chess friends, hope you are doing well. Today I like to explore you the most precious chess gambits which have more than 62% winning chances. We will dive into the King's Gambit Olecchine Defense Italian and many openings which will blow your mind. Let's dive straight into our video. First up, we're looking at a gambit played with the black pieces, known as the Elephant Gambit, specifically a unique version of it, for those unfamiliar. The Elephant Gambit starts with the moves knight f3 and d5. Where white has the option to capture in two ways. However, if white captures with the knight, black then takes back with the pawn. Typically, players will move their bishop to c4 targeting the vulnerable f7 square. At this juncture, black should opt for the wasp variation of the Elephant Gambit, a strategy I highly recommend. Statistics show that black boasts a 61% success rate with this gambit. While the video isn't overly lengthy, it succinctly covers the crucial tactic of allowing white to capture on f7, setting up a fork. The counterplay involves black capturing on g2, threatening the rook. If white responds by taking black's rook, then black can intensify the attack, leading to significant trouble for white. For instance, if white advances the king, they risk losing the queen and potentially facing checkmate soon after. Alternatively, white might block with the bishop, but then black can play knight f6, posing multiple threats and overwhelmingly dominating the position. Despite being played only a few times, black wins 88% of these encounters, which is highly favorable. If your opponent decides not to capture your rook and instead moves their own rook, you also have a clever move available, bishop to g4. This move puts their queen in a tight spot, forcing white to block with their bishop. You can then simply capture the bishop, followed by taking the knight since it's no longer defended by the bishop. This puts you ahead with 3 pieces, while white remains with only 2 pieces, giving you an advantage of a piece. Though your king might be a bit exposed, white's king isn't all that secure either. In this position, 70% of the time, black emerges victorious. This is known as the wasp variation of the Elephant Gambit. Moving on to a gambit you can play as white, stemming from the King's Gambit. Start with e4, e5, and then make the move f4, which initiates the King's Gambit. The most common response from black to the King's Gambit is actually accepting it and capturing the pawn, followed by knight f3 and then g5, defending the pawn and preparing to counterattack your knight. There are several options for black's next move. They could play h4 or bishop c4. Bishop c4 is the most popular, which we will discuss here, now. Black's most frequent move is to play g4, pushing your knight away since the queen is controlling these squares. It may seem like black is doing alright here with these pawns. You can then simply castle, completely disregarding the knight. This is referred to as the Museo Gambit, where you sacrifice a piece to get your king to a safer position and involve your rook in the game. Black may capture the sacrificed piece, and after you recapture, the most common move for black is to play queen to f6, with the queen coming over to help defend some of these weak spots that black has. Now, you can make the move e5, attempting to push away this queen. Even if the pawn is left undefended, you're not too concerned about that. In fact, you'd welcome black taking it, which is what usually happens. Now you can execute the double Museo Gambit with bishop takes f7 check, sacrificing another piece. If you opt for the triple Museo Gambit, which involves d4 check, queen takes, and then bishop to e3, sacrificing a third piece. Despite its name, you're not actually giving up 3 pieces, as capturing your bishop would lead to losing the queen due to the pinned pawn. This aggressive gambit often puts white in a favorable position, so essentially, black's optimal move is to move the queen. The best move, according to me, is queen to g7, although it's not commonly played in games. With only a few instances, a more intuitive move for most players is queen to f6. If black chooses queen to f6, a good response is simply playing knight c3, preparing to bring your knight into action. For instance, if black plays c6 to control that square, you can then play knight to e4, reinforcing your queen. Black doesn't have many good options. If the queen stays on the same file to block off these pieces, you can execute a powerful fork, leading to black's resignation. Alternatively, if black tries something like queen h6 to maintain the defense, you can capture with the bishop, putting pressure on the queen. After black moves, for example, queen to g6, take a moment to assess the position. White has 6 pieces developed, while black has only moved the queen. With our queen and rook aligned, along with a bishop and knight ready, the game is heavily in white's favor. I evaluate this position as plus 12, potentially even higher, indicating a clear advantage for white, and let me share a quote with you. Your thoughts will change your life, choose them wisely. This demonstrates the effectiveness of the triple Muzio gambit, offering fantastic winning chances for white. Moving on, let's discuss a gambit that many of you are likely familiar with, but for those who aren't, here's an introduction. It's called the fried liver attack, occurring after e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c5, which sets up the Italian game. Black has two main responses, either bishop c5 or knight f6, the latter being the two knights defense. Playing knight g5 in response to the two knights defense is a strong move. Aiming at f7, after black plays d5 to defend against the knight, you can capture it, leading to interesting possibilities. If black chooses knight a5 to avoid the fried liver, seizing the knight on f7 with a fork becomes viable, compelling black to capture. Following this, queen f3 check sets up a powerful fork, forcing black's king to e6. In exchange for one piece, you gain a positional advantage with black's king exposed. You can then castle, play knight c3 to reinforce, or push d4 to open up the position further. This creates a challenging situation for black, making the fried liver attack a compelling option for white. Moving forward, let's explore a gambit from the black side, arising from the king's gambit. Accepting the king's gambit as black, we encounter knight f3 g5, similar to what we've seen before. White casts and goes into the double and potentially triple Museo gambit. Another alternative for white is to play knight c5, setting up an attack. With the diagonal opened up early in the game due to the king's gambit, there are intriguing possibilities to explore despite the knight's movement. We're set to exploit the situation by executing a queen h4 check, and we have an additional advantage with an extra pawn in position. If white attempts to obstruct our move, we can easily capture that piece, leading to a situation where they can't retaliate without losing their rook. Therefore, white's only viable move is to shift their king to a safer spot. Next, we aim to counteract an impending threat by moving our knight to h6, preparing for an intricate strategy. This leads us to a move, d3 by white, which appears natural and sets us up for the schmid gambit. Here, we make a somewhat unconventional move, f3, which might seem odd because it opens up our bishop's path. Typically, white will capture the pawn, and our plan is to recapture it. This exchange seems to favor white, but it's not as concerning as it looks, because even if they capture with a check, we simply move our king forward. This leaves us pondering what white can do next, since they don't have any significant threats to our position. Now, the game dynamics change, and white's position becomes less threatening. Now, it's white's king that's in trouble. Following a standard developing move, what's our plan? We'll capture, they'll recapture, and we'll deliver a check with queen h3. If they retreat, it's practically game over, leading to checkmate. Thus, they must move their king to f2, which opens up opportunities for us. We could move our rook to f8, but it's actually smarter to play d6 first, pushing their knight away. For instance, if they play knight to e5, we can simply move our king back. It's not a big concern. Once their knight relocates, say to c4, we'll position our rook strategically, and white will find themselves without a viable attack. Our bishop, queen, and rook are in strong positions, dominating the board. The schmid gambit is definitely a tactic worth trying. Next, let's discuss a gambit from white's perspective, originating from the Alarkin's defense, where the opponent's knight moves to f6. The most effective response is to advance our pawns, creating space and maneuvering the opponent's knight. After common moves like knight to d5 and pawn to c4, the opponent may reposition their knight to b6. At this juncture, many players opt for moves like d4 and knight f3, leading to a varied game. However, another approach is to play c5, directly challenging the knight. Typically, the opponent will move their knight back to d5 as our pawns are now advanced, limiting direct attacks on the knight. We can then play knight to c3, applying pressure from a different angle. The opponent might defend with a pawn move or opt to capture, which is a frequent response. If they capture, we'll recapture with the d-pawn. Now, the opponent has options like playing e6 or d6, with most preferring d6 to start counterattacks and attempt to break open the center. At this point, we can transition into the matsukevich gambit by playing bishop to g5. This move might seem peculiar, as it doesn't directly attack a knight or present an immediate threat. It might look like we're just pinning a pawn, but there's more to this strategy. After the opponent captures on c5, which is a common move, we respond with queen to b3. This might initially seem unclear in terms of intent, but it sets up a complex trap. We need to consider the opponent's possible moves. For instance, a typical move like e6 isn't feasible because the pawn is pinned. Attempting to develop their bishop or knight could be futile due to our positioning. For example, if they develop their knight to c6, they could fall into a losing sequence, culminating in rook to d1. Attacking the queen with limited escape routes, the only try for black could be bishop d7, but then bishop c4 from us leads to checkmate, showcasing the strategic depth and potential of this gambit. And do you know a quote about life? Do not pray for an easy life, pray for the strength to endure a difficult one. Continuing with the scenario, let's consider how black might try to prevent the loss. Normally, e6 would be the defensive move, but it leads to losing the queen, showing there's no real way to halt the assault. The game is essentially lost at this point. White is dominating with multiple threats, and black is left with no viable counterplays, which is a significant dilemma. For example, if black tries knight to e7, we can play bishop c4, black would need to play e6 to avoid checkmate. But this move results in the loss of the queen. The situation becomes dire for black as the options dwindle. The only move that might seem remotely possible is queen to d7, which is an odd choice as it blocks the bishop and doesn't seem to accomplish much. Even after this, white remains in a strong position, perhaps moving knight to f3, maintaining control. Although this scenario has only occurred a few times in recorded games, white has typically secured an easy win. Highlighting the awkward position black finds themselves in, the matsukevich gambit, characterized by bishop to g5, revolves around this strategic positioning. The subsequent queen b3 and bishop c4 moves exert immense pressure, potentially leading to a situation where black's queen gets trapped. This gambit proves to be an exciting strategy to employ when the opportunity arises. Shifting our focus to another strategy in white's arsenal, we encounter the Vienna game. Initiated with e4 e5 followed by knight to c3, this diverges from the more standard knight to f3 move, indicating a unique approach. Following black's knight to c6, bishop to c4 and bishop to c5 are common responses, though black may start to find themselves in a precarious situation. Surprising as it may seem, the game progresses with white playing queen to g4, aiming directly at a vulnerable pawn, as moves like g6 introduce several weaknesses, making it an undesirable choice. At this juncture, most players would opt for queen f6 with black, as it serves a dual purpose, defending and creating a menacing setup. However, from white's perspective, this might seem dangerously close to checkmate. The twist in the tale comes when white disregards the apparent threat and plays knight to d5, initiating the Meissner-Mises gambit. This move baits black into capturing with the queen, leading to a precarious situation for them. Once the king moves, it becomes evident that black's options are severely limited. With key squares and pieces defended by white, white's position is now primed for aggression. Capturing on specific squares threatens to win rooks and dismantle black's defense. Faced with these threats, black's most logical move, d6, aims to activate their bishop, but white can counter by capturing on g7, intensifying the threat. The situation escalates in complexity, hence my suggestion to view the detailed analysis in the video. For instance, after black plays bishop e6, white can capture with check, leading to a triple fork. Surprisingly, capturing the rook might not be the best choice for white, as it allows black to take back a crucial bishop, controlling important squares and maintaining pressure. In this scenario, black is threatening a checkmate, which white needs to carefully avoid. The strategy involves white taking black's bishop with their knight. Since the pawn is pinned, it can't recapture, nor can the king because the knight is protected. Thus, white captures the bishop without repercussions, maintaining a strong position as black lacks substantial counterplay. Even if black saves their rook, it's inconsequential. White can then play knight h3, forcing black's queen to move, likely to h4. At this point, white has several strong moves, including moving the rook or playing queen g5 to initiate a trade. Given the material advantage, opting for queen g5 seems most promising, enhancing white's position significantly. This scenario is advantageous for white and is worth exploring further, or checking out the detailed video I mentioned. Returning to the knight d5 move, it's notable that white has a 69% win rate after this, underscoring its effectiveness. This position is not rare, it has occurred in 10,000 instances, especially in Vienna games. And do you know a secret life quote? Every morning, you should decide that today will be the best day of your life. Now, moving on to the landor gambit, which boasts an over 80% win rate, we encounter a different setup against the Caro-Kann defense, starting with e4 c6. The Caro-Kann has various tricks and traps, and the landor gambit is particularly intriguing, following the standard d4 and d5. White has multiple options like e5, e takes d5, knight c3, knight d2, and f3. However, it's the unusual bishop to d3 move that sets the stage for the landor gambit, a less common but potentially effective strategy in this context. Most opponents might fall for the trap and capture, which is actually a misstep, as it prevents us from executing our planned trap. However, occasionally, they might play knight to f6, leading them into a precarious situation. Our strategy involves pushing a pawn to chase the knight away. The knight can't move to certain squares due to our queen's control. If the knight attempts to advance, we can play f3, effectively trapping it. Our pawns and bishops control crucial squares, allowing us to capture the piece. The opponent's best response might be to retreat the knight to its original position, although most players in this situation opt to move the knight to another square. This sets the stage for the landor gambit, initiated with the move e6, putting the opponent's knight under threat. We are essentially setting a trap where moving the knight allows us to capture with check. The opponent is likely to avoid this, but if they capture with the pawn, we have queen h5 check. Following this, the opponent's likely move is g6, but then we capture with the queen, not the bishop, leading to a checkmate delivered by the bishop in a classic smothered mate scenario. If the opponent instead moves the knight, say to f6, we can capture on e6, severely compromising black's king's safety and preventing castling. Furthermore, we can develop our knight to f3, opening up various potent attacking avenues. This situation is highly unfavorable for black, creating a chaotic and vulnerable state for their king. The statistics underline the potency of this gambit, with win rates soaring to 79% and even 83% in certain positions. Although we might not always get to execute this gambit, as opponents often capture prematurely, when they opt for knight f6, we can effectively employ the landor gambit, showcasing its strategic depth and effectiveness. Wrapping up, I hope this discussion was enjoyable and informative, and don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel. Wish you all the best. Bye bye, take care.